There's a lot of discussion you brought up earlier about friction versus conversion. And there's a lot of people saying, I know that when I get to the other side, that this is going to be better, but they're afraid to make that leap and to risk some aspects of their business. Hey everyone, welcome back. Pat Kinsel, founder and CEO of Proof, here with David Stearns, author of the book Electronic Value Exchange. This is episode 2 of the Payment Parallel, and we're extremely excited to have you with us here today. So in episode 1, David and I discussed sort of the history of payments in this country and how absurd they were back in the day. Paper-based, shipping little slips around, fraudsters taking advantage of the entire system. And we wondered what might the world look like if the benefits of electronic payments could exist in everything else that we do in our society today. Today, we're going to do a deep dive on credentials. At the end of the day, everyone knows when you have a credit card, you have a specific thing that literally goes in your wallet. So to solve the problem of identity, ultimately people are going to need to be issued something. And the race is on. There's many companies that are vying for this with different strategies. And I again think that the history of payments with Visa, MasterCard, and other companies ultimately coming out on top is really instructive. And so David, I thought maybe we'd start there for episode 2. And you could walk people through a little of the history of what card did people have in their wallets before Visa came along, and why did Visa ultimately win?
Yeah, and it's a good point. Thanks for obviously having me again. And it's a great point to make that the Visa card, the Bank of America card, was not the first credit card that was ever issued in the United States. Cards that actually existed since the early 20th century. Initially, those cards were very single purpose. They were issued by a given merchant to identify the customers, usually at multiple branches of that same merchant. The first one was issued by Western Union Company for identifying customers at multiple locations who needed to send telegrams on the same account. All the major retailers had their own individual plans, Sears being one of the largest card issuers in the nation by the time you get to the 1950s and 60s. These single purpose cards were great, but they could only be used at that single merchant. And people would end up having this stack of them and they'd have to use them. And unfortunately, that also meant, though, that there was a lot of information siloing as well. So Sears knew something about you and you could use that Sears card at various stores, but Ward's or JCPenney, it was a separate account. It was uncorrelated with these two things, right? And so eventually we see, the rise of consumer credit bureaus that start to collect information across accounts. But it wasn't, it was a separate company. It was a separate sort of system from these card programs themselves. Now, in 1950 is when we start to see some of these narrow purpose cards get issued, and the most famous of them being the Diners Club. And a lot of people have heard of Diners Club and have heard the apocryphal story about how it started, which goes along the lines of the founder, Frank McNamara's caught out at a business dinner, not having enough cash to pay for it, and asked to phone his wife to bring cash in from Long Island. It's actually a totally made up story by their press agent, but it had
The
a
best
lot
ones
of,
always are, huh?
I know, but it really resonated with business travelers and people who had to do a lot of business entertainment because it was a common and real problem. So the Diners Club could be used at a wide variety of restaurants, and then eventually it gets used for anything sort of loosely connected with travel and business entertainment. And it becomes a fairly large program. It spreads across the nation and is one of the larger card programs that exists. But it was still very, what we'll say, kind of narrow purpose in the sense that it could be used for, say, business and entertainment spending, but it wouldn't be used for your everyday spending, right? It wasn't something you would use at a merchant that had nothing to do with travel and entertainment. These cards did get to be quite large despite that, but they were always had also a sort of a limitation on their brand. The brand was also communicated as an exclusive thing. So the Diners Club, it's kind of in the name. It's a club, right? And to have a Diners Club card said something about your prestige as a business person, and these were always backed up by the corporate expense accounts. So everyone knew that you were good for this particular meal or ticket or whatever you were buying. So they kind of needed to also remain a little bit more narrow purpose because they didn't want everybody in the nation to have a Diners Club card. That would kind of defeat the purpose. So Diners Club was the largest card program in the nation at that in the late 1950s. But when 1958 rolls around and the Bank of America card launches, which we talked about last time, because the Bank of America has a relationship with most of the households in California and most of the merchants that are doing business in California, they were able to almost overnight create a system just in California that was larger than Diners Club had ever been nationwide overnight. And part of that is because it was a general purpose credential. It could actually be used at a much wider array of merchants. And it was intended to be held by everyone. It wasn't an exclusive card. It wasn't a prestige card. It was an everyday card. It was meant to replace checks. It was meant to replace eventually cash. And so the expectation was that it was exceedingly general purpose. And we've seen this dynamic in payments a lot where initial sort of narrow purpose kind of payment instruments can often become very successful, but they eventually will get displaced and very, very quickly when someone comes out with a much more general purpose one.
So let's dig into that. So let's talk about the concept then of scale, right? And in your opinion, was the solution that they just had more people or that they had more transactions? And I think that's an important, as the identity industry today, everyone's coming at it from different angles, right? And is it a race to capture everyone? Is it a race to capture everything? Like, what are your thoughts on how that played out?
Yeah, simply having cardholders and merchants isn't it's a necessary but insufficient condition. You do need the participants to be there in the network, but if they don't do anything, then there's not much value happening. And in fact, the system will probably collapse because there's not enough funding to keep it running. And certainly, the more transactions that occur, you get two beneficial dynamics, right? More transactions means more revenue that can be used to maintain the system and extend the system. And two, more transactions means more data to be able to build up profiles of what a normal transaction flow looks like and what a fraudulent transaction flow looks like. And that distinction is, something that obviously has to constantly be, adjusted over time because fraudsters react just as much as, the detection systems get better. But more data tends to lead towards better predictions regarding whether or not a given transaction is potentially fraudulent. It's always, a percentage based with all ML stuff. It's always like, a percentage of how risky this is. And with payment systems, the usual technique is to say, when the risk level starts to increase, we usually introduce some sort of friction into the process. And that friction is meant to verify that the cardholder is the legitimate cardholder. And it's something that usually the legitimate cardholder can get over quite quickly, but a fraudster would either get blocked by it or would just kind of give up because it's too much to try to get over that amount of friction. As it increases, of course, and the fraud prediction gets much, much higher, then we may just choose to block the transaction. But ideally, you want to provide some friction so that the transaction can still complete if it's the legitimate cardholder, because this is all probabilities in the end.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to have a deep dive on that topic, but I'll avoid my vices on that one. So again, listening to you describe this, dynamic. It's about more volume, right, in order to capture the signal that you need, right, utility for the consumer. A lot of the industries that we're in today are starting to recognize that, right? So we do a lot of work in the retirement industry or in wealth management, in banking, and you're starting to see, the retirement industry is sort of something called LIMRA, or with LIMRA, something called fraud share, which is starting to actually share some of the data between, participants. And I'm wondering, given this history that we discussed, is that enough, right? Can these industries come together or not?
Yeah, again, the difficulty is that if the information sharing is still siloed, you can benefit from that information sharing, but only to the degree which the silo is large and has enough transactions in it that you can then leverage that information to detect potential fraudulent patterns. But it's still siloed, right? And this is the difficulty, I think, with information sharing solutions, is that it's siloed and the signals are delayed, right? So I think these are the two big problems. So, for example, with check guarantee systems, this is maybe an interesting parallel. check guarantee systems initially were designed to try to stop that scenario we talked about in the first episode of Pat can write a bad check at merchant A, but merchant B has no idea that that occurred, right? And with check guarantee systems, there was this attempt to say, well, if we start sharing information, at least we'll be able to flag Pat as a risk, a check writing risk. It's similar to how the card networks, of course, also printed these bulletins of known hot cards and these kinds of things. But these bulletins would get produced once a week, distributed out through the mail, so it would take another few days to arrive, and then the merchant would have to make sure and get it out to the cashiers. And so even if this sharing occurs, often you get this information delay that's going on. And it also tends to have like a limited amount of reach because of the silo in which the sharing is happening. Modern, if you want to say, or current payment cards like Visa, MasterCard, Amex, Discover, etc., because they're general purpose and because everything is happening electronically and every transaction is authorized back to the issuer, that information delay is just kind of goes away, right? As soon as that issuer wants to stop authorizing that card, it gets stopped in its tracks. Only in kind of like rare situations could it still be authorized because of, say network partitioning or just extreme examples of some, system being down at the moment. Or in ordinary scenarios, that card gets turned off right away. And also that because of it's such a general purpose credential, it gets turned off everywhere that that card is accepted. And there's no sense in which I can then go use that Visa card on a different network somewhere that allows me to then evade this particular shutdown. So I think information sharing is helpful, but again, it doesn't really solve the problem quite as effectively as having positive authorization requests going from the merchant all the way to that issuer and allowing the issuer to shut off the card immediately.
That's a great insight. And as I listen to you, where my mind goes is in order to deliver that experience, you have to also consider the consumer. And, reading your book and listening, I think more in our last episode, you describe, someone comes in and you hand them your card and they're literally running a imprint of your card and they're on the phone, if it's above the floor limit, trying to seek authorization in real time, as compared to today where you walk in and you tap, right? And so what do you think was the tipping point in the evolution of how cards were collected that really drove consumers to want to use them more to create that volume that was required to solve the problem?
Yeah, it may seem shocking, to current listeners that nobody was really asking for bank issued general purpose credit cards when they came out. There wasn't a really high demand for it, except for the fact that people, consumers have always bought things on credit in the United States. That's not something that was invented with bank issued credit cards. Yeah, buying things on credit was something that happens, from the history of the early republic. So people were used to this idea of buying things on credit, and the card sort of simplified the process, right? To say, like, I can now go make this purchase. I can either pay it off at the end of the month, or I can finance that purchase over a longer period of time. And so there was an attraction to using the card for sure. But initially, people weren't thinking like, oh God, I really wish I had a general purpose bank issue card. But as it became adopted, its value sort of like became much more obvious. People used it more and more. The volumes increased. And like I mentioned, the Bank AmeriCard system alone, just in California, eclipsed Diners Club almost overnight and just continued to grow, right? And eventually becomes nationwide and then worldwide.
The thing for me that I, envision is, you can imagine people having a negative reaction to this, right? We want to be able to analyze all your transactions, right?
Yeah.
There became a point though where walking into a store and presenting your credit card was actually the easiest thing that you could do. And I think that there's this self-reinforcing, model around that. And it's very interesting to me looking at sort of the history in your book from I'm already forgetting the name, but when you scan an imprint of the card, all the way through tap today, right? How efficient that is. I see a lot of industries on that same journey where they're still paper-based. And there's a lot of discussion you brought up earlier about friction versus conversion. And there's a lot of people saying, I know that when I get to the other side, that this is going to be better, but they're afraid, to make that leap and to risk some aspects of their business. And I think it's very interesting, your book, when it talks about floor limits and then the move to paying with a credential, fraud was somewhat accepted in order to move people forward, right? And ultimately get to a better place. And I'm curious, as you think, how that will play out in identity.
Merchants initially also were reticent to adopt point of sale terminals, um, and run these transactions, doing authorizations every single time. What really tipped the balance for merchants were two things. The first was that during the trials of these point of sale terminals, they started catching fraud almost immediately. And for a merchant, what that means is that their percentage of transactions that get charged back due to fraud, and a chargeback is when the transaction effectively gets reversed and the merchant ends up having to eat that transaction due to a fraud check that the merchant didn't do, for example. Um, those chargeback rates just dropped rather dramatically for merchants that accepted these point of sale terminals and were using them and encouraging their customers, of course, to use them as they became more self-service. Initially, the point of sale terminal was obviously run by the merchant themselves, and they would swipe the card and key in the transaction amount, etc. But there was a second incentive as well. So the first incentive was a massive reduction in chargeback, fraud, and fees. The second, though, was that Visa incentivized merchants to start using this by giving them lower rates, lower fees, effectively saying, if you do this positive authorization on every transaction, you won't have to pay quite as high of a merchant discount on this transaction. And of course, merchants love that, right? They love paying less fees to accept payments, and that encouraged them to adopt these transactions. And once they, or these point of sale terminals, and once they did, it became a virtuous loop where everyone realized this was just better, right? Now, in the identity industry, I think it's kind of interesting because I haven't been able to ask you any questions yet. So maybe I'm going to turn this one on to you. I have limited experience in the identity industry. Most of my information comes from talking with you guys and learning about what's going on. I have a little bit of experience, I guess, with having certain kinds of digital identity tokens I can use in very specific places. Like, I can use a login to one system only on that system, or I can maybe use my Google sign in on several different systems. But I haven't yet seen, I don't know exactly what's the possibility regarding a true general purpose identity credential. And maybe I'm going to turn that over to you and say, like, what has been happening in the industry towards that?
Oh, I think it's absolutely possible, and I will answer your question. But if I can steer the conversation, I think I can have you set me up perfectly to answer that question, which I think is, you mentioned earlier, signatures, and
Mm-hmm.
you say what people would do is you'd be presented with a card and they would look at the signature. And over time, you said back in the day, people cared more about their signature. It's interesting, in the notary industry, there hasn't been a lot of disruptive technology over the course of time. But one of the most disruptive things was actually the advent of the ballpoint pen. And if you think about pre-ballpoint pen, your signature would be much more sort of flourished and unique. And now it's the sort of brute, line that gets drawn. And then, of course, driver's license and this, concept of a derived identity where you wouldn't know someone anymore. Initially, you had to know the person personally and vouch to that fact. And now you could be reliant on a card. But, thinking about the actual literal card itself, right? And the evolution of going from, hey, let's look at someone's signature to the mag strip to the chip that's on a card, maybe to share a little bit, ignoring mobile payments where we are today in the world, like what is the actual thing that people carry in their pocket?
It has changed over time, of course. So initially cards had, signature authentication, and technically still the United States, we often do this as we still do this with credit cards, right? Even with chip cards in the United States, we still have signature as the authentication mechanism rather than say like a PIN, which is used much more in, well, the rest of the world, basically, where you would enter a PIN to complete that transaction and authenticate it. It's less important in the United States for that PIN authentication on credit transactions. And it's mostly because of the fact that every single transaction is authorized all the way back to the issuer. And the issuer effectively can limit their liability and their kind of financial exposure by adjusting your credit limit. So every issuer says, well, I'm going to issue this card. It's effectively an identity document. It's a credential, right? That says it's going to identify you to the network, and what's tied to it is this credit line, and it's an amount of money that the issuer is willing to take a risk on for you, right? Now, they would like for every single transaction to be very authenticated as well to make sure that the legitimate cardholder is the one conducting the transaction at that moment. And in markets where the fraud rates are much higher, that usually is where you'll see PIN-based authentication. But also in mobile wallets, now you kind of mentioned that mobile wallets exist now too, that the preferred kind of mechanism as well these days is to have some sort of biometric authentication happening via the mobile wallet. And that gives issuers a much stronger signal that this is indeed the legitimate cardholder. So ultimately, when an issuer gives you this card, it is a mechanism for identifying you to the network, and it is your sort of your token for getting into the network and completing a transaction. And what's tied to it, of course, is some pool of value, some asset that you want to be able to transfer to the merchant that's there.
A lot of the discussion that we've had today aligns perfectly with, how I see the world, playing out. And I think that so much of the identity industry is in silos like you described. There might be someone that is having a lot of success with, various government systems and being the identity layer, or they might, educational systems or financial systems, or they might be a vendor that's selling into the enterprise and enterprises are deploying that at some scale. And so I believe deeply that, identity needs to get outside of these siloed use cases into being a general purpose token. Our view at Proof is that is all about supporting lots of different workflows, right? And I think that in this country, KYC, AML, and a lot of the regulations around that has forced, the dollars that a bank will spend are in account opening. And so much of the identity industry focuses on account opening and putting people through this process of identifying themselves over and over and over again, because KYC, AML is about demonstrating compliance to a process, right? So everyone has to do it again because they have to demonstrate that they did it, right? So it doesn't matter that you've done it 45 times before. You're going to do it a 46th time, and they're going to save that you did. But once you've opened that account and once you're a customer, what about everything that you're doing, right? And that's been our focus as a company. The chip setup is that the little EMV chip on your card is PKI based,
Yeah.
right? And so for us, we think that PKI based signatures are the future to bring identity outside of these silos into something that can really support kind of general purpose transactions and be a universal token. I would also say that the discussion, you brought up liability, and so much of the identity market, you even said it, it's about scoring, 92%, 88%. But at the end of the day, in a payment network, someone holds the bag. And so much of, what we think to get to this general purpose token is someone stepping forward and taking on the risk and solving that problem as a network.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Not only about the chip card, but about the liability. Yeah, that chip that exists within your card, which incidentally is kind of interesting because it was actually invented back in the 70s. And they had prototypes of chip cards back in the 70s, but they were too expensive to deploy en masse, right? Part of the reason we ended up with the mag stripe is that it's just a very cheap and easy technique to put onto the cards at that time, and deploy it at scale. Everyone knew it was fairly insecure. Everyone knew that it was quite easy to copy these mag stripes. They knew it at the time, but effectively it was decided that it was the best they could probably do given the technologies and the costs. And as long as they were authorizing things back on the issuer side under every transaction, they'd be able to catch and shut off fraud quickly enough. But those chip cards do contain keys that are used to sign cryptograms that are sent across during authorization that help to establish that the card is actually legit and not a counterfeit card. Part of why chip cards were ruled out in Europe with pins was they had a tremendous problem with counterfeit fraud, right? And chip cards make counterfeit fraud much, much harder to do. And this is in contrast to say just stolen card fraud or lost card fraud. The cryptogram also has a nice quality around it that it contains transactional details that are then digitally signed, so that the issuer has some confidence that things weren't modified in flight. Because one of the other things we talked about in the first episode was, I get that notarized letter and the stamp has been put on my notarized letter, and there's not really anything that stops someone from modifying that stamp number or modifying the document that was notarized post notarization, right? And so some of the function of the cryptogram is to ensure that these transactional details don't get swapped out along the way from the merchant terminal to the issuer.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think we just had our Vulcan mind meld. And I think for folks listening, I think that the challenge is getting to that universal identifier, right? Or universal token that people can rely on across systems so that what you said is possible. This data can be shared between parties and be trusted, which ultimately is all about the creation of a network. And so I'm excited to get to the next episode where we're going to dig into the network dynamics of what makes payments successful and what the parallels are to identity. If I could make one last point on this topic before we break, I think it's important for people to understand that the problem is actually getting worse. And a lot of the technologies we're adopting today are exacerbating the problem. I don't know what our average age of our listeners are, but for those who know Cosmo Kramer and his wallet, right? He would try to shut it and it would explode as his cards would go flying everywhere. That's kind of the day of old, right? People would have their Diners Club card and their Discover card and their whatever, right? They'd have 50 cards in their wallet. And now you have a few, but pretty soon you're only going to have your phone. And I think what's interesting for people to understand is that the fraud rates on phones are actually worse than for people carrying cards. So it's a very urgent problem, to restore some trust in these payment networks. And you mentioned biometrics and identity, and there's so much for us all to do together. So I'll give you the last word, but otherwise excited to jump to episode 3 and talk about the network.
Yes, let's get into the authorizations and the power of the network. Thanks for having me on.
All right. See you next time.